Story 1. The Hermit in the Woods. Jake and his friends were on their annual hunting trip, deep in the dense forests of northern Montana. They had rented a cabin miles away from any nearby town, completely isolated. It was supposed to be a peaceful week of hunting and campfire stories, but on the third night, something went terribly wrong. It was just after midnight when they first heard the noise. The cabin was old, and it wasn't uncommon for the wind to creak the wooden walls, but this sound was different. Heavy footsteps circling the cabin. The first thought was that it could be a bear, but the steps were too deliberate, too human. Who'd be out here in the middle of the night? One of Jake's friends whispered. Nervously, they grabbed their flashlights and hunting rifles, heading toward the window to take a look. As the flashlight beams cut through the darkness, they saw him, a man, disheveled and wild-looking, standing just beyond the tree line, watching the cabin. He didn't seem to be lost or stranded, just staring. His clothes were tattered, his hair long and matted, and there was something off in his eyes, something dangerous. "Hey, what do you want?" Jake called out, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he took a step closer. Jake's heart raced as the man suddenly started walking towards the cabin, his pace quickening. "Lock the doors," Jake shouted, but before they could react, the stranger was already at the front door, banging on it with his fists. "Let me in," the man growled, his voice filled with desperation and rage. The door rattled violently under the force of his pounding. Jake's friends held their breath, terror washing over them. The man's fists beat harder and harder against the door, and the wood began to splinter. "If he gets in, we're dead," one of Jake's friends muttered. Without thinking, Jake grabbed his rifle. His hands were trembling, but he knew he had no choice. As the door started to give way, Jake fired a shot through the window. The bullet shattered the glass, and the man screamed in pain. For a brief second, there was silence. Then, without another word, the man fled back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. They were too shaken to sleep that night, sitting together in the living room, the door barricaded with chairs. At dawn, they called the local sheriff, who arrived with a team of officers. After inspecting the area, they followed a trail of blood leading deeper into the woods. By the afternoon, the police had found him, a notorious hermit who had been living in the forest for years. He was caught hiding in a decrepit shack miles away, muttering to himself. But that wasn't the end of the story. During the investigation, the police uncovered something far more disturbing. The hermit was linked to the disappearances of two hikers who had gone missing months earlier. Pieces of their belongings were found in his shack: backpacks, shoes, even an old, blood-stained jacket. Authorities later learned he had been living off the grid for years, becoming more and more unhinged, lurking in the forest, watching anyone who ventured too close. Jake couldn't shake the image of the man's crazed eyes, knowing how close they had come to becoming another one of his victims. The hermit was eventually sentenced to a high-security mental institution, but Jake still hears the pounding on the door when he closes his eyes at night, wondering what would have happened if they hadn't fought back that night. Story 2. The Wrong Ride Home. It was late, well past midnight, and David was driving home from his friend's house after a long night of poker. The roads were eerily empty, the kind of stillness that made the dark highway feel like it stretched on forever. He kept his eyes on the road, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. His car was running low on gas, and with no gas stations in sight, he started to get nervous. Just as he considered pulling over to check his map, he spotted a figure up ahead on the side of the road. It was a man, standing next to a broken-down car, waving him down. David hesitated. Picking up hitchhikers, especially in the dead of night, went against every instinct he had. But the guy looked stranded. There was no way he could have walked to the nearest town from there. Against his better judgment, David slowed down and pulled over a few feet in front of the man. The stranger jogged up to his window with a smile that seemed a little too wide for the situation. His clothes were disheveled, and there was something off about him, but David couldn't quite put his finger on it. The man claimed his car had broken down and asked for a ride to the nearest town. David's gut told him to drive off, but the man seemed desperate, and David didn't want to leave him stranded. "All right, hop in," he said, trying to sound casual, but the uneasy feeling gnawed at him. As the man climbed into the passenger seat, David noticed something strange. There were no belongings in the car the man had supposedly been driving. No bags, no sign that anyone had been traveling at all. His stomach tightened. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the tension in the car growing heavier with each passing second. David kept glancing at the man, who stared straight ahead, too still, too calm. Then, without warning, the man turned to David and said, "Do you believe in fate?" David's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What do you mean?" The man smiled that unsettling grin again. "Fate brought me to you tonight. It brought us together." David's heart began to race. He didn't respond, just focused on the road ahead. But the man's voice grew darker, more menacing. "You shouldn't have stopped, you know," the man whispered. "You never know what kind of people are out on these roads." David's blood ran cold. His heart pounded as adrenaline surged through him. Something was very, very wrong. Without saying another word, David abruptly slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, throwing the man forward in his seat. "Get out," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man stared at him, his eyes gleaming with something dark and dangerous. "You don't want me to do that," the man said softly. But David wasn't waiting around to find out what happened next. He reached across, yanked the passenger door open, and shouted, "Get out now." The man's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. Slowly, he stepped out of the car, his eyes never leaving David's. As soon as the door closed, David sped off, his heart racing, hands shaking on the wheel. He didn't stop until he reached a gas station miles down the road, where he pulled over, locked the doors, and tried to calm down. His hands were trembling uncontrollably as he replayed the encounter in his mind. Just as he was starting to catch his breath, he glanced in the rearview mirror, and his blood froze. There, on the back seat, was a small item that hadn't been there before. A rusted knife. David had driven away, but the stranger had left something behind. Story 3. It was a cold December evening, and Rachel was home alone with her 2 young children. Her husband had left earlier for a business trip, and she had just put the kids to bed. Everything felt unusually still that night, the kind of quiet that makes every creak of the house seem louder than it should be. Around midnight, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the front porch. Her heart skipped a beat. They weren't the casual steps of a passerby. These were slow, deliberate, and far too close to her front door. She froze, hoping it was her imagination, but then she heard it. The door handle jiggled, and her blood ran cold. Rachel tiptoed to the front window, peeking through the curtains just enough to see the shadowy figure of a man standing at the door, attempting to break in. Her heart pounded in her chest, louder than the silence of the house. She immediately dialed 911, whispering into the phone as she tried not to wake the kids or alert the intruder. The operator assured her that help was on the way, but Rachel could see the man wasn't alone. Another figure had emerged from the shadows, joining the first at the door. She backed away, clutching her phone like a lifeline, knowing that her only option was to keep the intruders from entering the house before the police arrived. She thought quickly and quietly barricaded the door with a chair. That's when the banging started, fists pounding on the door, rattling it on its hinges. She could hear muffled voices outside, laughing, as though they enjoyed the fear they were creating. The banging was relentless, and she could hear the lock beginning to give way. Suddenly, silence. The pounding stopped, and for a second, Rachel hoped they had left. But as she approached the door, a loud crash came from the back of the house. They had broken through the kitchen window. Adrenaline kicked in. Rachel grabbed her kids from their beds and rushed them to a closet, trying to stay as quiet as possible. She held them close, her heart racing as she listened to the heavy footsteps of the intruders moving through her house, closer and closer. They were speaking in low voices, their words too muffled to make out, but the intent was clear. They were searching. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Rachel's mind raced with thoughts of how she would protect her children if they found them. She could hear them rifling through drawers, knocking things over, getting closer to the bedroom. Just as she braced herself for the worst, she heard the faintest sound of sirens in the distance. The men must have heard it too, because their voices became urgent. Moments later, she heard them sprinting out of the house. By the time the police arrived, the intruders were gone, leaving behind a trail of destruction and shattered glass. The officers assured her that they'd do everything they could to catch them, but Rachel knew she'd never feel truly safe again in that house. To this day, she sleeps with every light on and hasn't spent another night alone.